Did you know? Breath of the Wild's prototype was originally centered around a real-life Japanese castle. One of the first decisions the game's director Hidemaru Fujibayashi made in development was to make his new reimagining of Hyrule big, really big. To help wrap their heads around the sheer size of it, his team built a prototype Hyrule the same size as Kyoto, the city where Nintendo headquarters is located. They thought about how frequently you'd come across convenience stores or mailboxes while walking across Kyoto, and used that to determine how often Link should stumble across elements like shrines, Koroks, and enemies. To help decide how far apart to make Hyrule's landmarks, Fujibayashi's team used Google Earth and 3D mapping tools to inject models from many of Kyoto's landmarks, which means in the prototype, Link was exploring places like Kiyomizu-dera, a 400-year-old Buddhist temple. Small sections of this prototype would be shown at CEDEC 2017, a Japanese conference for game developers which is closed to the public. Cameras were banned at the conference, but several photos surfaced in 2020, showing not only the Buddhist temple, but also Link skydiving into Himeji Castle, an 83-room complex dating back to Japan's feudal period. Unlike the other landmarks, Himeji isn't actually located in Kyoto, it's in Hyogo, about 60 miles away, but Fujibayashi insisted on its inclusion as it's his favorite castle in all of Japan, and is generally regarded as the most impressive feudal castle to survive into the modern era. According to Fujibayashi, Himeji Castle stood at the center of the Kyoto prototype, occupying the space that eventually became Hyrule Castle in the final game. Gameplay footage is yet to surface, but in some Japanese interviews we had translated, the developers mentioned a few more landmarks found in the prototype, like Tenmangu, a shrine dedicated to Tenjin, the Shinto god of learning. Another was Kyoto Tower, the 400-foot steel spire, which is also the city's tallest man-made structure. Another was Kinkakuji, the Buddhist temple with a golden phoenix on top that also served as inspiration for the bell tower in Pokemon Gold and Silver. There was also Ginkakuji, a 500-year-old temple with a silver bird on its roof, also referenced in Pokemon through Lugia. The Zelda team described the prototype as surreal, with some saying they felt like tourists, while others said climbing and jumping off castles and temples made them feel more like ninjas. The 1200-year-old pagoda known as Toji Temple was in the prototype as well, and even an old village, but probably the strangest location was Kyoto Station, which in real life is a hub for both above-ground railroads and underground subway tracks. Measuring 15 stories tall, it's the second largest rail station in all of Japan, and it must have been pretty strange to experience as Link. Breath of the Wild was the biggest game Nintendo ever created, with the Zelda team starting off at just 10, then eventually peaking at around 300 developers as it neared completion. Nintendo even had to borrow 100 staffers from Xenoblade Chronicles developer Monolith Soft just to get past the finish line. Shigeru Miyamoto said he specifically didn't want to bring on hardcore gamers, since they'd probably just try to improve upon what earlier games had already accomplished. He'd much rather hire designers with a wide array of skills and hobbies so they could introduce new ideas and a breath of fresh air. Breath of the Wild's producer Eiji Aonuma agreed with Miyamoto's philosophy, telling IGN, "I don't necessarily want to work with someone who's good at playing games. I'd rather work with people who maybe have an interest in climbing mountains or love scuba diving in the ocean. Just someone with a very different skill. And so maybe by having those skills we can incorporate them into our games." Mountain climbing was one of Breath of the Wild's core mechanics, but underwater exploration like scuba diving was never implemented, at least not yet. One of Fujibayashi's personal hobbies is cave diving. Together with other Nintendo staffers, he's part of an adventure club that explores underwater caves. Glitching Breath of the Wild's camera reveals underwater environments never seen during normal play, so it appears diving may have been experimented with during development, and might find its way back into the series in a future installment. Another developer hobby, motorcycle riding, almost didn't make it into the game but was pushed through at the last minute. The idea was initially rejected due to its absurdity, but Aonuma, who rides a motorcycle in real life, kept pushing and pushing, even whispering to Fujibayashi, "The bike, the bike," until he finally agreed. As a small compromise, they settled on making the motorcycle Link's reward for completing the final DLC, because even though it kind of breaks the game, at that point the game is already over. Initially, the team imported the Master Cycle from Mario Kart 8 and test drove it around Hyrule, but to make sure Breath of the Wild's motorcycle was absolutely perfect, they bought the programmer an off-road bike so he'd have an intimate understanding of how Link should feel driving on all terrains. As general producer, Miyamoto wasn't as involved in the game's prototype prototyping as director Fujibayashi. Fujibayashi recalled showing the prototype to Miyamoto, saying, "When we first presented this to Mr. Miyamoto, we left little treats like rupees on the trees, but we also left other things in other places we thought he might go, but he just kept climbing trees, up and down. And so we got to the point where we go, do you want to look at other stuff? But he just kept on going. He spent about an hour just climbing trees." That's when Fujibayashi knew they had something special, and from then on he frequently checked with Miyamoto to make sure he was happy with the game. But sometimes Miyamoto wasn't happy, and asked for changes. For example, until halfway into development, Link could stab a sword into a rock face while climbing to take a break and regain stamina. But Miyamoto said the mechanic was ridiculous, as people can't realistically stand on top of a sword. Fujibayashi was aware that the game was already full of unrealistic fantasies, like how lightning isn't actually attracted to metal, wind from a Korok leaf couldn't really push a sail, and even Link's glider was unrealistic. But in the end, Miyamoto was the boss, so the rock stabbing technique got cut. Initially, Fujibayashi considered including up to 120 items in Breath of the Wild. He came up with a list of original items, as well as every item from previous Zelda titles, like the hookshot. He told IGN, "In the early stages of development, we actually do some tests with double hook shots and just being able to kind of go anywhere. Like Spider-Man, your mobility and your speed was just kind of incredible. There's lots of fans in the staff, even at pretty high levels, who really like the hook shot and they kept bugging me about it. I eventually just had to say, no, there will be no hook shot in this game. Breath of the Wild is all about doing new things." Ultimately, he decided less is more, and whittled Link's arsenal down to just 4 Sheikah runes, although some items ended up being repurposed as weapons, like the boomerang and the Korok leaf. The last item added to the game was Cryonis, adapted from the Sand Rod from A Link Between Worlds. Probably the strangest item that went unused was the Spy Drone. Alongside Magnesis and remote bombs, official concept art shows a device that pops out of the back of the Sheikah Slate and folds into a drone shaped like a dragonfly, similar to how the Sheikah Slate summons the motorcycle. According to concept art, the drone had a rotating camera on the bottom, which presumably would have set the camera's perspective to the Sheikah Slate, as well as to the Wii U gamepad. Link's drone is pretty similar in appearance and function to the real-life Parrot AR drone, which may have been another one of those developer hobbies we talked about earlier. The AR drone was the world's first mass-market drone that ordinary consumers could purchase and fly right out of the box, no technical expertise required. And it was an international sensation, selling over 500,000 units between 2010 and 2013, the exact same time Breath of the Wild entered development on Wii U. Just like Link's Dragonfly, AR drones were controlled with a tablet or smartphone, had a bottom-mounted camera, and sent live video directly into users' hands. Having a drone could have allowed Link to scout hard-to-reach locations, solve puzzles, or just have fun pestering animals or skimming the water's surface. The Dragonfly drone would have been perfect for the Wii U's unique hardware, with Link's point of view appearing on the TV screen while the drone's perspective appeared on the gamepad, with touch controls used to change camera direction. AR drones were also capable of hands-free flight, either by following a set path directed by its owner, or instructed to simply follow its owner, which in Breath of the Wild would have made it possible to capture the kind of footage shown off in the game's trailers. To be clear though, the concept art doesn't specify hands-free flight, so we can only speculate how the Dragonfly would have functioned if it hadn't been cut. When Nintendo decided to release Breath of the Wild simultaneously on both Wii U and Switch, some exclusive gamepad features got thrown out so both versions would offer an identical experience. The only function confirmed by pre-release footage was map access, but that footage also shows a button to access additional functions. Fans assume item management was one of them, but apparently the cuts were much deeper than just quality of life improvements. According to Fujibayashi, disabling the gamepad meant even the game's story had to be changed. Just a few days before launch, he said, "When it was originally just for the Wii U, we had touch controls, but we had to remove them. We felt the way the Sheikah Slate is represented in the game and how we use the gamepad in real life synced really well. So when we had to remove it, I did feel like, oh, it's too bad we had to do that. And because it was so tied into the scenario, we did have to go back and redesign and rethink the scenario." In the end, they made it so the Wii U gamepad literally does nothing. It's just a black screen when you're playing on the TV, and if you switch gameplay to the gamepad, the TV then goes black. Conversely, there were also some ideas that only would have been possible on Switch that got scrapped so the game could still run on Wii U, like HD Rumble-based gameplay, which Eiji Aonuma says will probably make its way into the sequel. As he explained it, the Switch's HD Rumble allows you to experience what a character feels when they touch something. For example, when they take an object in hand, you can feel it through the vibrations. It's a rather interesting approach and adds more realism, and we wanted to develop gameplay around it. It wasn't time constraints that kept us from implementing these ideas, but but the fact the Wii U and Switch versions had to be identical. But in the future, we'll be free from this limitation caused by the dual console connection, so we'll be able to use it in the next Zelda. In the game's final build, players collect resources to convert an empty slice of Hyrule into a quaint village called Tari Town. But despite being a fan favorite, Tari Town was actually a much less ambitious version of its original concept, which would have allowed players to customize their creations any way they wanted. In other words, a little more Animal Crossing and a little less fetch quest. According to Eiji Aonuma, originally we wanted to make something players can build on their own. The backside of that story is actually when we were creating Breath of the Wild, the planners wanted a part of the game that could use game design tools and not rely on the programmers, so that's how Tari Town and also the house came about. In Creating a Champion, an art book that describes lots of ideas changed in development, lead structural artist Manabu Takehara appears to be providing more details on that original concept, and seems to imply that houses could be constructed all across Hyrule, rather than restricted to one small area. He says, "These square rooms are simply stacked together and locked into place. Then you can add a wooden deck or flower bed in whatever way you choose. They can be freely and easily arranged as well. Of course, they are easy to break down and can be transported later as you see fit." Will Bolson be able to rebuild Hyrule with his innovative stacked construction? However, in the final game, all methods of customization were ultimately stripped out, and every player's town ends up looking exactly the same. But it's worth noting that the original, more personalized concept is still reflected in the final game's architecture. Unlike the rest of Hyrule with its more traditionally built homes, the homes in Tari Town are built from stacked containers, because they were initially intended to be rearranged and relocated. Alongside some animal-based ideas that were implemented, like horses eating apples and shaking off water, early concept art also shows some ideas that didn't make the game's final cut, like horses swaying in tune to nearby music and sticking their heads through windows while Link's inside a house, as if to say, "Hey, what you doing?" Cuckoos can be seen sitting on Link's head, seemingly against his will, and a giant Cucco was considered as a flying steed, presumably because their usual glide mechanic from earlier games was made redundant by the glider. Concept art also shows Link petting a dog, and the developers even explored giving dogs the ability to talk. Feedback from fans actually made Fujibayashi reconsider the level of animal interactivity for Breath of the Wild 2, telling IGN, "In the game it seems like you can do anything, but what it really is are all these interlocking systems where you actually have a pretty limited number of actions that can do a ton of different things. So we would actually have to put in a custom action just for petting a dog that couldn't really be used for anything else. But finding out that people want to pet dogs gives me a lot of motivation, a lot of ideas for things we can put into the sequel." Speaking of animals, concept art also shows 6 unused divine beasts, like a manta ray and submarine-themed whale, who it's probably safe to assume were planned for Hyrule's ocean. And this giant mechanical crab was probably meant for a beach environment. There was also a Brontosaurus surrounded by lightning, which is fitting since Brontosaurus is actually a Greek word meaning thunder lizard, possibly considered for an area that's always storming, like Thundra Plateau. A land-walking jellyfish appears to be based on the tripods from War of the Worlds, and another is possibly based on a chimera from Greek mythology, which are usually depicted as lion-goat hybrids with a snake for a tail. Or it could be a Brazilian headless goat, a legendary creature with flames instead of a head. Even the champions could have been different. In place of Revali, concept art shows a whip-wielding Kokiri champion, suggesting an entire village like Kokiri Forest was considered as well. As for Link, the art team submitted over 100 designs before deciding on the Link we know today. Interestingly, the reason Link wears blue in the final game is thanks to the pajamas from Wind Waker. In a Famitsu interview we translated, art director Satoru Takizawa said in the early stages of development, they imported Link in his pajamas into Breath of the Wild just as a placeholder. But later on, when they were remodeling Link's design, they realized the blue stood out against Hyrule's green landscapes, and decided to use Link's pajamas as the basis for the champion's tunic. Eventually, the PJs were added to Breath of the Wild via DLC, not only because of its significance during development, but also because it's Eiji Aonuma's favorite outfit. He said he wears it to work, to promotional events, and he even wears it off the clock, although he admits the lobster design doesn't actually make sense, since there's no lobsters in Hyrule, even in Wind Waker. To build a gigantic open world, Fujibayashi instituted a new strategy he called open-air development. He felt that one of the problems weighing down Skyward Sword was that the team got so big, the opinions of the younger staff got drowned out by the older developers who had seniority. So for Breath of the Wild, he set up a whole new system, which was basically an in-game version of Reddit. Every 3 to 6 months, the entire team spent about a week playing the game start to finish, and throughout their journey, anyone could anonymously post signs saying which parts of the game they liked and which parts parts they didn't like. If another developer saw their sign and agreed, they could upvote it, and at the end of the week, the signs with the most upvotes let Fujibayashi know which sections of Hyrule needed to be changed the most, regardless of the voters' seniority within the company. Fujibayashi also hooked up an early version of the Hero's Path to all the developers' playthroughs, and had a giant TV in his office so he can monitor their progress. Using his subordinates like guinea pigs, he watched where they were going, where they lost hearts, and where they were dying, and used the data to decide where to increase or decrease difficulty spikes. For example, he said in Famitsu that everyone kept falling to their deaths climbing the Sheikah Towers, so they were redesigned to make them a little less dangerous. Initially, Nintendo's higher-ups didn't like the idea of pausing development so everyone could play the game beginning to end, since they expected it would delay the game's release. But eventually they were won over by Fujibayashi's strategy, and agreed it was actually speeding things up in the long run. Fujibayashi explained to Edge magazine that by understanding the game as a whole by playtesting it, our developers could understand what the colleague next to them was working on. It's horizontal information sharing. We overcame the boundaries of roles, which often isolates information. This had quite a huge effect on the project. When the testers discovered bugs in the game, like how you can use magnesis on a metal object to propel a boat like a motor, or fly across Hyrule on a flying log, or float through the sky in a minecart, Fujibayashi told them they should only fix the bug if it hampered the experience, but if it was fun, they should leave it in. The developers' guiding philosophy for Breath of the Wild was breaking conventions, a mantra they adhered to even for the game's music. After heavy deliberation, sound designer Hajime Wakai chose piano as the game's central instrument, but doubted his decision up to the very last minute. Instead of piano, he almost centered the soundtrack around the dulcimer, and if he had, Breath of the Wild would have sounded something like this. The sound team wanted to include some classic Zelda series melodies, but Wakai made it a rule they couldn't reuse old music for cheap fan service. So for some tracks, they composed reimaginings, like the Hyrule Castle and Ganon's Lair themes, but they also went out of their way to hide some iconic themes, a few of which you can only hear by speeding up or slowing down the game's soundtrack, like the title theme from Zelda 1, revealed in the nighttime horse riding music when you double the tempo, and Zelda's Lullaby found in the daytime riding music by tripling the tempo. Quadrupling the tempo for Breath of the Wild's house interior music reveals the same theme from Ocarina of Time. Ocarina's Temple of Time melody is hidden in the new Temple of Time music, but slowed down and broken up with pauses. And the music for the Rito's original home, Dragon Roost Island, can be heard by speeding up the music in their new home, Rito Village. And finally, this theme made its debut in Zelda 1 as the Recorder, which was later reprised for Ocarina of Time's title theme, then eventually made its way into Breath of the Wild's shrine music, made a little more apparent when you slow it down. Did you also know Retro Studios almost made a post-apocalyptic Zelda spin-off on Wii, and that Ubisoft almost made Wind Waker 2 on Game Boy Advance? If you want to hear about 9 Zelda games that died on the vine, or learn even more about Breath of the Wild, click on the videos on screen. And hey, if you enjoyed today's video, click the like button. It helps us in our war against the YouTube algorithm. And subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this one. Thanks for watching.